From the Silicon Valley in California, welcome to the inaugural program of PodGrunt. I'm Craig Severson. So what's a podcast? Well, I'm glad you asked. And if you're familiar with the other shows in the Grunt series, you know we're going to start with the basics. A podcast is simply an audio or a video file delivered to your computer over the internet. And that's it. And you might be thinking, what's the big deal? I mean, we've been getting audio and video over the net for a long time. Well, the difference is in the way that file is delivered to your computer. You see, a podcast gives you a mechanism by which you can subscribe to a program like you would a magazine, but it's all for free. And the content is like a radio or a television show, but it's pre-recorded and lives on your computer so you can look at it any time. And one of the other cool things about podcasting is that this new method of distribution is so efficient that it allows most anyone with a good idea and some reasonable talent to make a show about something that they have passion for. And because they're unfettered by time or content constraints like a traditional broadcaster would, you can get some really interesting programs that never would have been possible to get before. So we're going to go over the basic mechanism of how a podcast works so you can see how simple and unthreatening it really is. Here's an example. Let's say there's this guy named Joe, and he has this idea for a weekly show about marmalade, because he likes it. And he decides to call it The Joe Show. In his home studio, Joe records 2 initial episodes to get started. With these 2, he feels ready to go public and launch The Joe Show podcast. To do this, he signs up with Acme Web Hosting and uploads his first 2 episode files. And because he's creating a podcast, a special file is also created that keeps a running tab on the episodes and contains basic information about The Joe Show podcast itself. We'll talk more about this file down the road, but for today, let's call it the control file. Now, let's say you've got a penchant for marmalade yourself, and you've heard about The Joe Show from a friend. From your computer, you launch a podcatcher application like iTunes and ask it to subscribe to The Joe Show. Your computer sends a message to that control file to see if there are any new shows there. And since this is your first time, it indeed finds the first 2 episodes that you don't have, and it downloads them onto your computer. From there, you can listen to them anytime. Now, please notice that I didn't say you have to listen to this on an iPod. It's a misnomer to think you need an iPod to enjoy a podcast. That media file you got from Joe is just like any other audio or video file on your computer, and you can watch it from there. Now, the good news is that most podcasters configure these files so you can play them on the iPod, and that's a big part of the benefit. So, now that you're subscribed, your computer will automatically check the control file for The Joe Show to see if there are any new episodes. If there's nothing new, nothing happens. And all of this goes on in the background on a periodic basis, so you don't have to do anything manually. Now, let's say a week passes and Joe has recorded the 3rd episode. He uploads his audio file to the Acme host as before, and the control file subsequently updates as well. When your computer checks the control file the next time, it notes that there is a new episode that you don't have, and it immediately downloads it for you. And that's how simple a podcast works. You, as the listener, let your computer keep you up to date on the shows you subscribe to, and Joe, as the producer, just needs to send his new files up to his host so you and anyone else in the world can get them. You have full control over the shows you want to get, and Joe has full control over the content he wants to provide. This simple method of distribution is the key to the coolness of podcasting. Now, in future episodes of PodGrunt, we'll go into more detail about all of these components of podcasting that we summarized today. In the beginning, we'll take the perspective of you as the podcast listener, and as we exhaust that subject, because it won't take that long, we'll take the perspective of you, the podcast creator, and go over all the technical underpinnings you need to know to make your podcast run smoothly. So subscribe now, and coming up in Program 2, we'll tie in the illustration we made today with what you see on your screen in iTunes.